menurut Aisyah, mungkin kita di sini bilingual. Jadi Ronggo, jadi actually there is a problem ya. Banyak negara-negara yang mengalami aging atau banyaknya oldest generations dalam negara itu gitu. Dan juga berkurangnya kepercayaan publik pada pemerintah. Ternyata kita juga harus ini aktif untuk memberikan dialog opini gitu ya kepada pemerintah gitu ya, Ronggo ya.
Yeah, Professor. So allow me to do this in a bilingual way. So
sure.
Actually, yeah, the question from the other moderator is coming from another student, and the question is like, is there a correlation between the lack of youth participation and the increasing demographic with the reduce in trust to the government? Because it's like a growing trend in Indonesia where now the youth are more likely to care nothing about the government at all. So it's like, as we saw in the data that you provided, in the Asia, it's actually below 40, at the age of 40, it's like the youth participation in Asia is the lowest out of among all other continents. So it's actually curious because it's supposed to be the youth are more educated than the previous generation, and yet they are more and more apathy towards the government. Yeah. Do you have anything to say to that?
So at one level, so I would, in general, not blame the youth for this so much as blame existing political institutions, which I think, and again, I think this is a phenomenon, not just the case in Indonesia, it's also the case in the United States and elsewhere, where people feel that political institutions are not responsive to their concerns or needs, and don't necessarily feel that there is a mechanism or a way by which they can change them. And so they prefer to focus on their kind of private interests and concerns out of a sense of despair, in effect, that these institutions are ever going to be helpful to them. Now, the only thing I can say for sure is if you ignore these institutions, they're not going to be responsive to you. So if that is a concern, the only way to make them responsive is to engage them. It is to, participate in those mechanisms and processes that are available. It is to protest when necessary, and to recognize that political systems only respond to organized interests. So just individual interests, unless you're very powerful and very wealthy, in which case that's great, and the political system will respond to you. But if you're not that, the only way you are going to get political institutions to respond to you is if you're organized. So collective action is really the only kind of vehicle for that. And in sometimes it may be too challenging to do that at the national level. And so then it's about identifying opportunities with respect to local levels to be able to do that. So I guess the way I see the problem is that if political institutions cannot demonstrate their importance to young people, then we will see this continuing erosion of the legitimacy of those institutions, democratic or authoritarian, because the youth increasingly feel like there's not a space for them there, and their interests are not taken into account. And that's a sign, that's a fault of those people who exert power in those institutions. But we can't, I'll say, you can't count on the old people to kind of learn those lessons. You have to force them to do so. And that's where, and I do feel, there have been moments when the youth has clearly spoken in respect to a whole host of reform issues. And I think that's the evidence of, when the youth does come together, it can make its voice and impact heard. And that's, I would say that that's really the only hope that we really have. But the fault is clearly, very much. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. So yeah, I would say I could see probably the individual interests that are able to spill over international in Indonesia, because there seems to have a lot of power in Indonesia. And also speaking to the youth movement that you mentioned, in Indonesia, there was a protest in 2019 called Reformation di Korupsi. It's like banished reform. So it's actually led by the youth that are still in the middle high school. So allow me a few seconds to interpret your answer to the audience. Jadi untuk teman-teman, kita tidak bisa fokus pada menyalahkan generasi muda. Jadi kita tidak bisa hanya kenapa kok generasi muda tidak berpartisipasi pada public policy. Tapi kalau institusi politiknya saja tidak bisa memberikan kita kepentingannya, apa yang bisa mereka berikan kepada generasi muda, maka kita tidak bisa serta-merta menyalahkan generasi muda itu sendiri. Jadi dari generasi muda sendiri jangan hanya menunggu, karena kalau kita menunggu, political institution hanya akan merespon kepada mereka yang memiliki interest, yang memiliki interest di pada mereka, yaitu contohnya organized interest atau individual atau apapun. Nah, makanya generasi muda ini harus organize untuk collectively, sehingga kita bisa membuat suara kita didengar. Dan kalau itu sangat sulit dilakukan pada level nasional, maka lakukanlah pada level lokal. Karena semakin generasi muda tidak mempedulikan institusi politis, mereka juga akan semakin tidak mempedulikan kita sebagai generasi muda. Jadi institution tidak akan merespon kepada perubahan yang tidak dipaksakan. So, paksa mereka dan gunakan aksi kolektif untuk membuat mereka mendengarkan kita sebagai generasi muda. Dari Aryani, apakah ada pertanyaan?
Oke, kayak cuman I have to respond it like, what if we don't have any change to do that gitu? Because public policy, kayak aku campur nggak apa-apa ya, karena public policy.
I will help you interpret to the professor.
Okay, thank you. We have to deal kayak dari youth generation to the older generation. Kita harus deal nih, kayak gimana caranya kita bisa deal kalau dari youth generation kita sendiri, kayak termasuk aku sendiri gitu, kurang memahami maunya dari older generation ini apa gitu, dan mereka juga kurang mengerti youth generation ini maunya apa, how to deal with that gitu. Mungkin itu aja sih. Makasih.
Terima kasih banyak. Thank you very much, Aryani, for the question. So the professor, the question is like, how the youth generation could understand what is the older generation want, and vice versa. So there's like a gap in between generations, and those gaps are really hard to overcome, even in the countries like Indonesia, where people say